Hello everybody, how's it going? Welcome to this lesson on the contracts process, or otherwise, how a promise becomes a contract, becomes a law. My name is Quincy Stiles. I'm putting on this video, this presentation, so thanks for joining. Let's get right into it. So I'm going to start off with a quote from one of the founders of contract theory, German philosopher Immanuel Kant. He coined the phrase "meeting of the minds," meaning we need to come together kind of on a personal level and understanding to have any kind of agreement, any sort of contract. So this quote from him: "Live your life as though every act were to become a universal law." I think it's pretty cool. But anyways, let's get on with the lesson. So I've basically dialed down this process, I call it the contracts process, into 7 steps. Contract, as you can see, being kind of in the middle. But we're going to start talking about kind of common understanding, body language, what it's like when you walk into a room and you expect everybody to kind of be civil, all the way to kind of documenting those civil, what it's like to be human and just in a society, with human rights universally enforced by such structures as the UN. So going from basically just, we're a tribe, think of Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and then all the way to where we are now, where we enforce universal human rights, even across country borders. So first step, we're going to talk about that little, where we start and where we go from there. So I call this common understanding, instincts. So this is survival of the fittest and spoken environmental stimulus. When you walk into a room and you see other people there, you're expecting to be reasonable. Body language matters, dress, how you speak, how you present yourself. You're still kind of wary about others and whether you can come to any kind of understanding, agreement, contract, right? So it's still, the first process. We don't have that implicit trust yet because we haven't, establish the trust of you in relation to others. So there's a little bit of outsider syndrome in that, but it's the basic understanding that we can we see where we are, we can see, hear each other and talk with each other and work something out. Second step here is implicit trust, as I mentioned. So you kind of have that in-group trust now, meaning they're on my team. Or if not on your team, at least we can work something out here. It's not quite a promise. You're not coming to any kind of deal yet. It doesn't have that explicit covenant with you explicitly saying something or, handshaking a deal even. So in an example, when you cook dinner, someone cooks, maybe the other does the dishes after, and you might expect that from an implicit trust sort of standpoint. So it's not necessarily a spoken agreement. It's not explicit, but understood as a sort of goodwill gesture in compensation for efforts. So it's a little bit more than just showing up in a room and being reasonable. It's like, hey, you cook dinner, I'll clean, just for example. As alluded to, third step, explicit covenant. So we're a little bit talking out what we're trying to agree to. It's essentially a promise still, just like the last one. You're getting there. Explicit does go a little bit further. So, I still have the same slides here from the bottom, but look at the top 2. So I'll just focus on the second one. Explicitly agreed to, but not signed on the dotted line. So maybe a handshake deal, as I say up there in quotes. This is the third step. Let's move on since that slide was a little bit messed up. Fourth is signed agreement. So this is otherwise known as a contract, symbolized by the letter K. The step everyone thinks of when you're signing on the dotted line, whether it's an employment agreement, whether it's electronic these days with you're getting a new subscription to your music provider or something like that. But there are terms, there's payment that takes place. There's a great Suits episode about what makes a contract, whether it was meant in good faith. There was a meeting of the minds. It was inked. So there's a little bit of a, it's a product. It's out there. So meeting of the minds, as we started out with Immanuel Kant, this was kind of This is solidifying that contract. So there's a question, when does a handshake deal become a contract? When does a contract become enforceable, maybe by a higher power in terms of a law, when you might go to dispute something like that? And then the question of the notary public, who's it, signed by? Was it docusigned? Who's kind of, who's authorizing this? Who's the overall supporting? Should you go to some kind of arbitration? Next step in this process, 5th out of 7. We're kind of going through this quickly, but a sovereign constitution, meaning laws essentially. So this is kind of getting past even contracts where you're inking a deal between two parties. It's a social contract between the state and the people. It's kind of getting towards the gray area of what's a guarantee or not from the state, or a freedom to or from something. So again, this could be your county laws, state, national, federal laws, the basis of, so as opposed to trusting or social rulemaking, a basis of law, meaning it's written down, it's historical, we've got precedent. It doesn't matter if you sign to agree to anything, you were born in a certain place, you're living or visiting a certain place, you abide by their laws. Comparing this to an explicit covenant, where you're kind of saying out loud, hey, I'm going to do this if you do that. This is, like the other side of it where you don't need to say anything, it just is, based on the powers that be. Let's move on to the next one, and that's international treaties. So this is, country to country kind of basis, so nations making deals or laws with each other. So NATO is a good example, meaning like a bilateral, multilateral treaty to defend each other. The EU is a famous example of countries coming together under more of a supranational organization. It's more or less between the leaders of those nations making deals right on the authority of the country, but it's also binding to all their citizens, like the binding of soldiers to fight, as I think a good example. And then mutually assured destruction was a treaty, the nuclear arms treaty, obviously, countries coming to deals with each other that affects its citizens. And note there, especially important between neighboring countries who share a border. And then we can kind of compare this, so on the scale with the 7, the contract being in the middle, this is the 6th, penultimate step, comparing it to the 2nd, in this line or circle, you could even refer to it as, but implicit trust. How often we care about the concerns of your neighbors on the border, like how much they influence you. There's only so much you can do to enact certain multinational like agreements, like on border policy or something like that. But there's a feeling that we both want to prosper as nations. So we might as well come together and come to some sort of treaty for this. Last step, and then we'll move into sort of the more interaction or immersive part of this lesson plan that I've put together here. But let's talk about global human rights. As I mentioned in the beginning, kind of like the UN enforcing, the right to eat, shelter, to be safe. Those types of basic general understandings that are now codified into kind of world laws, in so much as those can be made or enforced. So there's also international groups I mentioned here, like the World Bank, IMF, Red Cross, that are fighting for these same types of principles where people everywhere should have access to banking or medicine, or should they appeal, doesn't matter what country you're in, it's kind of we're all in this together. So mentioning lobbying for laws like the Red Cross might do for global health reasons. We saw obviously the COVID pandemic recently, that kind of was a worldwide effort for pandemic and global health responses. So just the idea of bringing this full circle to comparing it to a common understanding, mutual respect. We're trying to go through the whole process and see how we might raise the boats for everyone so that, metaphorically we step into a room, treat everybody respect and expect that with respect and expect that we can come to reasonable conclusions or agreements. So yeah, let's keep moving forward. So I've got some questions to consider here just about these ideas, this lesson. And so kind of what do you guys think? What's the biggest gray area? Where does, three meet four? When does a handshake deal become a contract? When does a contract between kind of like the people and the state become a law, and how, county to state, federal, how do those laws kind of weigh against each other? The role of a notary and like docusigned and who's enforcing such contracts. The social contract is obviously a big political philosophy topic, just about implicitly, respecting the laws of the boundaries of the state. It doesn't matter whether you agree to them or not. One-sided technology contracts, like when you use Instagram's privacy policy and you just say okay to it, or Apple, you just say okay to it. What's the legality there? What might be your favorite step? Is it, making handshake deals like I talked about the dinner, kind of implicitly knowing, whichever, you don't need a contract for that. But then also, when do you need a contract? Like for business deals, employment contracts. And then when should something maybe go from country law to, more of a treaty where you're like chip makers in Taiwan and just global trade events like that. And then how much do we rely on contracts in our society for employment, housing, cars, like the terms there, health, legal, all that jazz. So just questions to consider. If you have any more, let me know. Here's a perspective partner up exercise to kind of build off the ideas in this lesson. Come up with an agreement for each stage. So maybe the first can be don't steal from others. Like we walk into a room and you can expect that your things are safe with you, and you don't expect anything like that. You could make personal deals with each other. Like, hey, if you're stolen from, like, I'll help you, or I'll try to make sure that somebody doesn't do that. Third, maybe making an agreement with somebody, like you agree to trade lunches. And then the fourth, like maybe put in your contract, right? Like if you see that the other person's got a better lunch than you, or just want to make sure that they have a lunch at all, you're kind of protected in that way because you have a contract that could be enforced. So then after you partner up, kind of making deals with other groups, like if anybody, a more like we'll protect these groups, making treaties in that kind of way. And then kind of leading up to the whole class being like, if somebody doesn't have lunch, the teacher provides. That's like a coming up to the fullest kind of universal human rights idea of just that there's, we can work to have a common cause where we acknowledge that if someone doesn't have lunch, maybe they should be provided, just in this classroom example, in terms of like health standards and that you have food to eat, that you're not starving, stuff like that. And then lastly, quick homework assignment, as this is a lesson. Come to a simple agreement with somebody in class or at home, like the dinner example, just thinking about that in your daily life. When it might make sense to sign a contract, or like a loan, like I'll give you $100 if you repay me in a month with 10% interest, so you repay me 110 in a month. When it might make sense to write that out as opposed to shaking your hand on it. So like a homework assignment could be write something up. It can be the simplest thing ever, but just put it on paper, sign it, have it be kind of, I guess I could be the teacher, be the notary public in that way, enforcing, the fact that the contract's executed and the terms are being followed, and the delivery is what it should be. So and then that's pretty much it. That's what I have for you all. Thanks for listening. This is about 15 minutes, which isn't bad. Go out, do something fun today. Just keep this in mind. I thought this was fun to put together and kind of conceptualizing it this way. Thanks, and Appreciate it. Have a good one.